Rabosai, we're here on Daf Nun Aleph Amid Beis. Amalei Rav Safra, one line up before the end of the Amud. Now, back at the time of Kiddush al Piriyah, the Shluchei Bezdin, once they determined when Rosh Chodesh would be sent out, and they would notify the various communities that there was a Kiddush HaChodesh. However, there were outlying communities that were far away, and the Shluchei Bezdin never got to them before Yom Tov. Now, since every month could either be a Chaser or a Mole, they were in a Sveika Diyoma. They didn't know which day was Yom Tov. And therefore, they had to observe both days with the Kedushas Yom Tov misafek. And the Gemara now is going to embark upon the following investigation. What happens in a case of a person who goes from location X to location Y? In location X, his point of embarkment, they knew exactly when Rosh Chodesh was, and therefore when Yom Tov was. They had no need, and they did not observe 2 days Yom Tov, but he finds himself on Yom Tov in a location where the Shluchei Bezdin did not arrive. They were in a situation where they didn't know whether the previous month was Chaser Umale. They didn't know which day was Yom Tov. They were observing 2 days Yom Tov, Sveika Diyom. So he knows, based on the Shluchei Bezdin, exactly which day Yom Tov is, but he finds himself now in a location where they don't know, and they're observing 2 days Yom Tov, al Sveika Diyom. Now, based on our Mishnah here at the beginning of the 4th Perek, the halacha is that a holech mimakom she'osim malacha l'makom she'ein osim malacha. He finds himself on Erev Pesach in a location where the minhag makom is to observe the morning of Yudalit as if it were Yom Tov, meaning with an Isa malacha. Then he has to observe the minhag makom she halach l'sham, meaning he has to pick up the chumrah of the place where he finds himself. Amalei Rav Safra l'Rabbi Abba. Rav Safra, apparently, now what I'm about to say is Rashi's interpretation of the sugya. We'll see that Tosfos quotes Rashi, which we don't have, with a different interpretation of the sugya. In any event, the interpretation of the sugya of Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi, as we have Rashi, is the following. I come from a place, says Rav Safra, where they know exactly when Rosh Chodesh was and when Yom Tov is. They are Makom Sheshluchei Bezdin Magiyim L'Sham. Now I'm here with you, Rabbi Abba, in a location where Lo Yadina B'Kviya Diyarcha. They don't know exactly which day was Rosh Chodesh. The Shluchei Bezdin didn't arrive here. In the location where Rav Safra now finds himself on Yom Tov, they are observing 2 days Yom Tov. And therefore, I, Rav Safra, am in a bind because although I know exactly which day is Yom Tov, I cannot observe that day and only that day is Yom Tov and exclude myself from Yom Tov Sheni because I find myself now amongst and in a location where they aren't Bekiya B'Kviya Diyarche, the Shluchei Bezdin did not come, and the minhag is that on the second day they will abstain from malach. Now all of this is Rashi and Tosfos, the way we have Rashi. Tosfos in Masechet Sukkah quotes a Rashi that we don't have, and I'm just going to give my own little twist here. I think that this other Rashi is based on the fact of the language of Rav Safra. It's a little bit odd. Kigon anan, and he speaks about himself in the royal we, diadinon b'kviya diarche. He says yadina means, I would translate as, I know when the kviyas is. What do you mean you know? Mi samcha, who are you, Rav Safra, with all due respect? He should have pointed out that he comes from a location where the Shluchei Bezdin reached that area and they know. But what's this anan yadina? That's just my take on why Rashi, as quoted by Tosfos, has a different interpretation of the sugya, namely that Rav Safra was a baki in Iber Hashana. He knew the ins and outs of Kiddush HaChodesh, and you'll see that Tosfos on the bottom here of Nun Aleph Amud Beis quotes somebody, he doesn't mention it, in Tosfos Sukkah he actually attributes this to Rashi, that Besod Ha'ibur, and then he rejects it, velo, but leave out the word velo, and that interpretation of Rav Safra is that he knew the Sod Ha'ibur. I knew. What does Sod Ha'ibur mean? Sheyodea es Sidur Kvius HaChadoshim. He was an expert in the astronomy and also in the halachic regulations that govern whether this month is going to be chaser or mole. And therefore, Yoda Masai Yachulu Rosh Chodashim, he could actually predict in advance when Rosh Chodesh would be. He didn't need Yom Tov Sheni because he personally did not have a Sveika Diyoma. Now, Tosfos rejects this pirush that's attributed to Rashi because the Gemara says in Beitzah that all the Babylonian Jews knew exactly the Soda Ibur. It was not a secret that no one knew. It was common knowledge. Says the Gemara, Mikol Makom, nevertheless, even though they knew Bekiya V'Soda Ibur, they could predict when Rosh Chodesh would be. Nogim Hayu Salo Lasos Melachim Yom Tov Sheni. And why is that? Because of a halacha called Minag Avoseinu B'Yadeinu. So that even though we are B'kiyim, the Gemara says, in Kfiyas HaChadoshim, the Minag was established of observing Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golus. And the Gemara goes a step further. The Gemara even tells us that after Hillel HaNasi, that's Hillel HaSheni, after he established the calendar, they would no longer be Mekadesh Al Pi Re'iyah. Nevertheless, they continued to observe in those places where they originally had a Sveika Diyoma, Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golus. So therefore, Tosfos says, how can I accept Rashi's interpretation? Again, we don't have this Rashi, that Rav Safra was a baki b'seder ha'ibur, he could predict exactly when Rosh Chodesh is. That's totally irrelevant. The Gemara says that the observance of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golus was accepted, despite the fact that they knew exactly when Rosh Chodesh is, and that's called Minag Avoseinu B'Yadeinu. In any event, getting back to the original interpretation that we suggested based on Rashi as we have it, based on Rabbeinu Tam, you'll see he quotes Rabbeinu Tam on the second line here. Haya b'makom sheshluchei bezdin magir. He, Rav Safra, was in a location where the shluchei bezdin arrived. So we're not talking about Minag Avoseinu B'Yadeinu. According to Rabbeinu Tam, we have to put this Gemara and Rav Safra into a different historical context. We're going back into history. According to Rabbeinu Tam, we'll let the historians figure out if they accept Rabbeinu Tam. That's a matter of science. We'll see. Maybe Mitch will tell us what Rav Steinsaltz has to say about this, but this is a typical Rav Steinsaltz area. And Rabbeinu Tam is insisting that Rav Safra went back to the period of time before Hillel, when they were Mekadesh Al Pi Re'iyah, and he himself was located, that's his, where his private house was, in an area, locale, where the Shluchei Bezdin arrived, and those areas where the Shluchei Bezdin did not arrive on time, they had to observe Yom Tov Sheni. It was not a set minhag, and it all boiled down to where you are, where you were located. So Rav Safra says, look, I come from a place where we know the Shluchei Bezdin have told us exactly when Rosh Chodesh. I don't need to observe 2 days in Yom. But now I find myself amongst in a community where the Shluchei Beis Din have not arrived, and the people here, therefore, are in a state of Sfeika Diyom. In truth, I would like to suggest the following, and I hope I'm not wrong about this, but I think that this sugya that we're about to learn, according to Rabbeinu Tam, is not really the sugya of our Mishnah per se. Yes and no. I mean, it overlaps with our Mishnah because the Mishnah is very sensitive to what's called al yeshana mipnei hamachlokes. That part of the Mishnah for sure is relevant. But the first part of the Mishnah, which deals with Erev Pesach in the morning, and you left one location where they had one minhag, and you found yourself in a different location on Erev Pesach where they had a different minhag, that's not really what we're talking about. Because we're going back in time to the period in which there was Kvias Alpi Re'iyah, the Edom came. There were locations where they knew about it, locations where they never got the word on time. They had to observe Yom Tov Sheni Midin Sveik the Yom. This is not Hilchos Minhagim. We're not dealing with a community that has a definite minhag. And I would tell you, again, you can quote me on this, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. What can I do? That you could have a community that not only from one year to the next will change its quote unquote minhag, but that's an improper word. On one year, they observed 2 days of Yom Tov. The next year, they observed 1 day of Yom Tov. I'll go even further than that. Sukkot, they observed 2 days of Sukkot, and on Pesach, they observed 1 day of Sukkot. Because on Pesach, they already got the message on time. But in Sukkot, they didn't get the message on time. Or, for example, you could talk about Rosh Hashanah, right? Rosh Hashanah is Aleph Tishrei. Did they get the word on time to observe 1 day of Rosh Hashanah? They didn't get the word. In Sukkot, at least they had another 2 weeks of time until maybe the word got there. Finally the Facebook message, was received. But Rosh Hashanah, maybe they didn't get the message.
What?
Go ahead.
The Mishnah, Shelas Tam. What minhagim is the Mishnah talking about? They only mention one minhag of a malacha, right. And we're deriving from that all kinds of minhagim.
Right.
There has to be some kind of definition. For example,
right.
If somebody is a Sephardi and comes to an Ashkenazi community, can he eat kitnius on Pesach?
Right. That's a great question. I don't know. Maybe Rabbi asked me this question in a week. The whole perek is really addressing your question. At what point do we say that it's not a machlokus? We have two different communities. They happen to be located in the same area, or there are definite minhagim that are attributed to one particular. You know what I'm saying? I can't answer all your questions, but I want to know the following: are you willing to agree that whatever the criterion are, which we don't know exactly what they are, we just have this one case so far, and we had another case about a minhag with regard to Chalev Hayeser, and we had another question about a minhag of Sfiche Shvius in the case of Kruv, Sfiche. We have a couple of cases to go with. But would you agree with me that these rules about, that you have to observe a minhag because you ended up in that place, that's irrelevant to our sugya? Would you agree with me? We're not talking about minhag over here. According to Rashi, which we don't even have this Rashi, but in any event, we're talking about minhagim, because we're in a period of time where Hillel has already established what we call Kvias Alpi Cheshvan. So we have the calendar. We know exactly when Rosh Chodesh is. The whole enterprise of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath is minhag. As I state in the Gemara in Beitz Daf Dalet. Now, Rav Safra, according to that shot of so-called Rashi, is in a situation where he's in a location that never accepted that minhag, and then he goes to a location where they did accept that minhag. Why was he in a location where they didn't accept that minhag? Because they never had that minhag. Because the shluchim came to that area year in and year out when they were Mekadosh al pi re'iyah. So they never evolved such a minhag. Now you want to know, you find yourself in a place where they also know exactly when Rosh Chodesh is. They know which day of Yom Tov is. Don't fool you. I have a cheshbon, I have a calendar, I hang up my calendar, I can look it up. But there was a minhag avosenu. This was the location where the shluchim didn't get to. You know, I don't want to tell you this because it's so confusing. There are opinions, and the Rav said his uncle had this opinion, that even in Yerushalayim, they claim that there were places where the shluchim didn't get to. And if you're outside of Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, you know, you're on the wrong side of Shuk Machne Yehuda, you also had a minhag of Yom Tov. I don't know, you know, it gets very, very complicated.
The Brisker Rav had 2 days of Yom Tov in Yerushalayim.
Correct. Now, what I'm trying to suggest is that if we're going back in a time machine to the point at which there was no minhag, it was all a question of Sveika D'Yoma or not Sveika D'Yoma. So then our sugya, and that's the way Rabbeinu Tam understands it, has to be understood in a different light. It's not really a literal application of the rules of our Mishnah about minhagim, but rather it's applying the rule or the logic of Shelo Yeshana Mipnei HaMachlokas. Whereas if you go with that so-called Rashi that Tosfos quotes, that we're dealing with a historical period that's much later in time, then we're talking about the minhagim, and then we go back to our Mishnah. Now, exactly as you point out, Rabbi, what are the parameters of this halacha? Do I have to accept the local minhag? Do I not? That we're still grappling. Okay.
Whereas the Gemara in Beitza, where it says minhag of to be adenu, I'm not convinced that our observance of Yom Tov Sheni is minhag today. I think there's a takana that Chazal made.
Right,
and
it could be that
it changes the whole perspective. Right.
The question though is, Rabbi, where do we find, that's what I've been looking for a long time, where do we find the source in Shas, you know, that they made a takana? You know, we had it in Rosh Hashanah.
It's a Rambam. It's a Rambam.
And where did the Rambam get it from? You know,
well,
I wonder.
Think a minute for a minute. There's a possibility of a Sveika D'Yoma by Sukkot and Pesach. There is no concept of Sveika D'Yoma by Shavuos, right? We agree to that?
Right.
Because Shavuos, we absolutely know it's 50 days after Yom Tov. Okay? The Rambam says, nevertheless, we observe 2 days of Shavuos because of a takana of Chazal. So you can extend that idea to all the Chagim.
Right.
So now the question arises, if in one place you have a takanas Chazal and another place never accepted the takana, what happens when you get together? You have a takana of Rabbeinu Gershom that you can't marry more than one wife. What do the Sfardim do who don't accept that particular takana when they come to an Ashkenazi community? That was a big machlokas here in Eretz Yisrael at the very beginning in 48. And if I recall, Rav Ovadia Yosef went against the takana of the Chachamim of 1950, and he particularly said that they can marry more than one wife. I don't know how to deal conceptually with this whole issue.
All right, so look, Rabbi, I don't know what to tell you. You know, there's a fellow, I don't want to mention his name, but you know who I mean. He wrote 7 volumes on these issues. In any event, let's just see what happens with Rav Safra. What do you guess is going to be Rav Safra's decision over here? And this has to do with airports. What do I mean? If you take a look on Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph, Rav Safra declares, B'yishuv lo avid. I'm skipping. Bamidbar mai. And the final conclusion of Ami is Bamidbar mut. So again, we haven't gotten into the nuances of this sugya. What exactly is midbar and what is yishuv? But just on a superficial level, we say the following. Have you, Rav Safra, arrived in the community? We'll give you a red carpet treatment. when you enter into the gates of our community. So Rav Safra says the following: as long as I'm in the midbar, now we don't have to take the word midbar literally. Midbar means there's no Jewish community. Then that's one set of rules. But if I already arrived in the Yishuv, then I have a problem of mipnei shini hamachlokas, which means if I'm going to do malacha on Yom Tov Sheni, again, it has to fit into one of the 5 categories of Chol Hamoed malachas, right? Then it's going to create a whole to-do. I mean, people are going to create a machlokas over here. And therefore, I cannot change the local minhag and do malacha in their presence. Again, we have to understand what happens if he locks himself in a room. That's a different issue. But once I reach the issue, that's it. I have the issue of lo yishana mipnei machlokas. But as long as I am in the midbar and I have not yet touched ground within the bounds of the community, we have to see that Chum Shabbos, if it might be relevant, then I can continue with what I know to be true, and there's no Yom Tov Sheni. Okay, now, if you take a look at Tosfos on the top of the Amud, he makes 2 points. B'yishuv lo avdinon. Now, what do you mean b'yishuv lo avdinon? Why are you worried about machlokas? Why don't you lock yourself in a room? So places afilu b'tzina. Okay, we have to analyze that. Then Tosfos adds another chiddush. Afilu daito lachsa. Wait a minute. We spoke about accepting the minhag where you find yourself, minhag shahalach l'sham, in a case what was lo ain't daito lachsa. He now takes on the new minhagim, and he comes from Holland, and they only wait 1 hour, but here in Poland they wait 6 hours. And you now settled, you relocated yourself in Poland. You have a Polish passport. So you have to observe 6 hours. That's called ein daito lachsa. Rav Safra was daito lachsa, says Tosfos. But nevertheless, lo yeshana mipnei machlokas, he has to observe the Easter malach of Yom Tov Sheni, even though he was daito lachsa, afilu daito lachsa. So these are the 2 chidushim that have to be analyzed, and they have tremendous repercussions. So let's talk about the first chiddush of Tosfos, afilu b'tzina. And as you know, on Masechet Pesachim, we merited, somehow Jewish history merited, having a tremendous work of the disciple of the Ramban, Rabbeinu David. We don't have it on too many Masechtas. And he writes the following: Efshar lasos malacha b'tzina. What do you mean Efshar lasos malacha b'tzina? I don't know. That's a pretty way out idea. Isn't it? There is no concept of b'tzina as far as malacha is concerned. Malacha, by definition, is b'faresi. It's not b'tzina. And he says, Madua tzarech lachush leminag hamakom be'iser malacha. He says, Harei masha eino sim malacha, eino machmas minag. Right? He's going back to Rabbeinu Tam, and the assumption that the whole business in that particular historical early period of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golos is Sveika Diyama. And therefore, Masha Eino Sim Malacha, Umishum She'enom Yodim Mosai Chal Yom Tov. Dover Zeh Eino Nechshav L'minag. I just don't know. I don't have the idea whether this is also a mutter. That's not a minhag. And therefore, he asks the following question. Why is Rav Safra, who knows exactly what Yom Tov is, obligated to observe their minhag when it's not even a minhag? It's all a question whether you know or you don't know. And in the Kasha, Rabbeinu David is assuming that even if Rav Safra was born and bred on the local soil, if he had access to this information, He would not have to observe Yom Tov Sheni. The whole business is fake in the Yoma. Yesh Lomar. Shebizman Rav Safra. Now listen to what this sounds like. He's making historical evaluation or reinterpretation. Bizman Shel Rav Safra Kvar Lo Kidshu Al Pi Re'iyah Ela Al Pi Kvius Hachadoshim Al Pi Takonas Hillel. They knew exactly when Yom Tov Sheni. They knew exactly when Yom Tov was. Who does it sound like? The Rashi that we don't know exists, but Tosfos says exists. Umasha you know Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golius. I don't get it. You have the calendar of Hillel. Why do you need to observe 2 days of Yom Tov? There's no Sveika Diyoma. Umitam minigavul seichem biyadechem. Kimavur bebeitza daf dalit on beis. Lachein yesh toras minog umechayev es mi shahalach l'sham. Rabbeinu David just completely rejects the interpretation of Rabbeinu Tam, which is our Rashi, that Rav Safra lived before Hillel at a time when they were Mekadesh al Pi Re'iyah, and it was all a matter of suffix. And Rabbeinu David can't tolerate that shot, because if that be the case, then we're not dealing with minhagim. You're going to have to introduce some sort of concept called Lo Yeshana Mipnei Machlokas. What do you mean Lo Yeshana Mipnei Machlokas? You have a Sveika Diyoma, so you have to observe 2 days. I have access to classified files, and for me, it's not a Sveika Diyoma. I don't have to observe the second day of Yom. So what's his business here then? And in Midbar, I don't have to observe, but when I get to the Yishuv, I have to observe. So we have 2 chidushim now, Rabosai. One chidush is that there's no difference between Sinah and Farhesia as far as Malach is concerned. Meaning, again, if we're talking about abstaining from Malacha, let's say, for example, I come from a place where they don't do Malacha on Erev Pesach in the morning, right? And now I come to your community, you do Malach. So I want to observe. So you remember that Rava said yesterday that Kama Batlani Ika B'Shuka. That's in one direction if I abstain from Malach. But now I come from a place where we do Malach, and I find myself in a place where they don't do Malach. You can't utilize Rava's svara of Kama Batlani Ika B'Shuka. Ella, what you're going to tell me? But I'm doing Malacha B'Tzina. I lock my door. I put down the shutters. Brand new chiddush. There's no such thing as tzina with regard to malach. And Rabbeinu David goes a major step further, and he says that if you're talking about minhag, and what the Gemara has in mind is that once you arrive at that community, you have to accept that minhag. Then you're talking about a historical period after they long terminated the Kiddush al Pi Re'iyah. They were in Kiddush al Pi Cheshbon, and they had the calendar of him. Now, what exactly is midbar? What exactly is mid? So here we have 2 points, one from the Chidushei Aran and the other from the Baal HaMaor. The Ran says that what's considered a midbar, he says, chutz l'tchumei kol hayoros. This is a wild chumrah. I'm not exactly happy about this, but the Ran didn't call Berzon up to ask him. The Ran says that if we're dealing with a minhag, and again, he's in that school of thought of the so-called Rashi and Rabbeinu David, then that minhag was accepted all over the Golos. Kol b'nei HaGolah. You're Israeli. There was never a minhag of Yom Tov Sheni in your place in Israel. You show up in Eretz Yisrael. So what's midbar? Unbelievable. says the Ran, Midbar is chutz l'tchum shel kol hayoros. You have to find a location that is nowhere within the tchum of any city in Bavel, in this case. Because if you're within the tchum of any city in Bavel, you already have to apply that minig, because the minig was accepted not city by city, but by the entire Golos, all the Bnei Golos. And only if you find a place that's chutz l'tchum shel kol hayoros, so you have let's say, Russia, for example, is a very gigantic country, right? So you find, some in Siberia, there was never well, that's not true, but anyway, somewhere you find a place on the map, there was never a Jewish community there. So it's chutz l'tchumei kol hayoros. Then he says that if you find a minhag that was accepted by one city, then he says midbar means beyond 2,000 amma of that city. That's not going to help us here in the case of Yom Tov Shel Golos, because minhag was accepted by all the Bnei Golos. And therefore, the entire district, the entire country, is all considered one large yishuv, unless you find a place which is not within a tchum of any city whatsoever. But if it's a minhag that was accepted by one particular city, then midbar would be anywhere outside the tchum of that city. Again, are the wild animals on the, out there in the midbar? That's irrelevant. What's relevant is that you're not within the bounds of the city. That's called a midbar. Now I have a chiddush of the Baal Hamor. And again, I'm hoping that we'll be able to put this all into perspective when we come to the end of the sugya, because there's so many different dimensions to the sugya. So Baal Hamor says the following. What about a case, which is not Tosas's discussion, of ein dai tolachs? Rav Safra is relocating. He's carrying in the caravan all his pekelah. He called the Sabalim, the movers. Says the Baal Hamor, even though it's ein dai tolach, so the exact opposite of Tosas, kevan shadayin lo hukva kan, he's on his way, and he's still in the midbar. He has not yet arrived. I mean, here I think the Baal Hamor is talking about literally a midbar, some sort of unsettled, unpopulated area. Is therefore muterhu lasos malacha afal pi she'ein dai tolachs. In other words, he only drops his original minhag and picks up the new minhag when he arrives at his destination. As long as he's on the road, ask him where his mind is, he's already there, Achen, then the Baal Hamor agrees with Tosfos, and he says, Im kvar higia liyishuv, no, this is not Tosfos, but another point. Im kvar higia liyishuv, then aser hu afilu b'midbar. And why? Because again, the Baal Hamor is learning that it's ein dai tolachs. So basically, the Baal Hamor is challenging us. He's saying, what about a person who lives in an area where the minhag is to abstain from malacha on Yom Tov Sheni? B, he knows exactly when Yom Tov is, And C, he celebrates Yom Tov out in the midbar. He's chayiv in Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golos. Why? Because kfar hukva shem ben bava, or whatever the word for chutz la'aretz would be, ben hagola. So for a ben hagola who doesn't have a suffix, he's obligated in observing Yom Tov Sheni in the midbar because he simply is committed to his minhag. Midbar is not going to do anything. Says the Balamar, so what's our discussion here, Rav Safra, about midbar? It's only about someone who is not yet hukva in a makom of the gola where they have this minhag, even though he's ein daitolax. He simply hasn't touched base. It's like a baseball game. Until he touches the base, he doesn't belong to that base. He could be tagged out. So he continues his original minhag. Again, it's all conditional on the fact that he knows exactly when Yom Tov is. He doesn't have a suffix. But he continues his minhag until he touches base on the area where the community is, and they are knowing that second day of Yom Tov. He's ein daitolaxa, but he hasn't yet shed the cloak of his original minhag. He can continue his minhag. Once he touches ground in the Yishuv, and he now, since it's ein daitolaxa, has established himself as a ben hagola, we'll call it, then midbar is not going to help. There's so many different aspects to this sugi. Now, the poskim, I'm not familiar with all the poskim, but some of the poskim at least, and I hope others as well, claim that if you are flying from Eretz Yisrael and you land in the airport, then you don't have to observe Yom Tov Sheni in the airport. And here it splits into two. Some poskim say, l'chumra, you better stay in the airport. So what happens is you flew on Yom Tov Sheni, which for you is Chol HaMoed. So you left Tel Aviv on Chol HaMoed. You landed on Yom Tov Sheni. Again, those poskim who allow this divide into two subcategories. One will be machmir, and they say, look, man, you better stay in the airport. Why? Because if you take a cab from the airport, you will arrive in the Yishuv when it's still Yom Tov. And other poskim will say, look, you're now in a midbar. Again, we'll get back to this issue whether the airport is a midbar, but assuming that we're going according to those mekilim that the airport is a midbar, you don't have Yom Tov Sheni. You will only be obligated to Yom Tov Sheni when you enter into the Yishuv. So what you have to do is, you can get in a cab, but you have to guarantee that the cab will only arrive in the Yishuv after sunset. And other poskim will say the whole thing is completely awesome. Why? Because the airport is not a Yishuv. I'm sorry, the airport is not a midbar. Why isn't it a midbar? The answer is because there are workers, teams of employees by the hundreds who work in the airport. I don't know about today, I'm not sure, but when my wife went to see her mother, the airport was totally empty. It was mamash a midbar. I don't want to tell you this, but in order to use the washroom in Ben Gurion Airport, she had to break through a barrier. And she wanted a cup of coffee. There was no coffee to buy. I don't know what it is today, but I'm just telling you a few months ago. I'm sure it hasn't improved thousands of percentage points. But if you talk about, JFK Airport on a normal Sunday, Shabbos was Yom Tov and Motzei Shabbos was Chol HaMoed. And I got on a plane and I landed in JFK Airport on Sunday, let's say Sunday at noon. Okay, that's I don't know if there is such a flight, but anyway, I landed Sunday noon, and it's Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath in New York City. And some would say I'm not allowed to do that because as soon as I get off the plane, I have violated a malacha in a makom shenoagim Yom Tov Sheni. What do you mean? I'm in a midbar? No, you're not in a midbar. It's well popular. And other poskim will say, well, there's no Jewish community there. I once was thinking, and I asked one of the Rosh Yeshivas here, what about if there's a shul in the airport? Would that change anything? Would that make it into a yishuv because there's a synagogue? I'm not sure exactly today, but I remember back in the day, there was a synagogue in JFK Airport.
There is.
I don't think it exists anymore.
No, it exists. It exists.
Oh, it still exists. So that question would be perhaps an intelligent question. But it's very interesting. In one occasion, I actually flew, I think it was Marseille or someplace in France, and we got there, it was pretty late, but it was still before Shkia. And I looked around on the plane and I was wondering, are there any other frum Jews who pulled the shtick, to get an extra day in France, And sure enough, there was a Rosh Yeshiva on the flight. I mean, with the whole, the whole guard. But in that case, we were able to get a cab that took us into the yishuv after we got into the yishuv after Shkia. But all these issues about Bamidbar, what is Bamidbar, are all relevant today. Okay, now we go on to an interesting sugya, and I've been trying to make some sense out of this sugya myself. The issue at stake is a person who violates Yom Tov Sheni in Chutz La'aretz. He does so because he knows when it's Kviyat B'Yarach, and he does it in a Yishuv. And the issue in the Gemara is what punishment should we impose upon him? And there are two possibilities. One is called Nidui, otherwise known as Shamta, and the other is Makas Mardus. Now, what's the relevance here of Nidui? Nidui, classically, is imposed upon someone who undermines Kvod HaChachamim. If he's chutzpahdik to a Talmud Chacham in a profound way, they can put him into Nidui. So Rabbi Nosson Bar Asya, again, I don't know why the Gemara had to mention his name. It's a little bit embarrassing for his children and his grandchildren throughout, thousands of years. Anyway, Ozal mibei Rav lepumpedisa b'yotav sheni shel atzeres. So he came from the Beis Medrash of Rav in Eretz Yisrael, and he shows up on the second day of Yom Tov of Shavuos in Pumpedisa in Bava. And he did malach in Pumpedisa on Yom Tov Sheni Shel Gol. So the next time they asked you, who did malach on Yom Tov Sheni in Pumpedisa, 1,800 years ago, you'll tell him it was Rav Nosson. Shamtei Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef put him into Nidui. Now, the Meiri, I think, is a little bit nervous about this sugya. Why would Rav Nosson go ahead and do malacha in Pumpedisa on Yom Tov Sheni? Now, keep in mind, we're in a bind over here because at the end of the day, Rav Yosef put him into Shamta. He must have done something wrong. But on the other hand, to say that Rav Nosson did malacha on Yom Tov Sheni and Pumpedisa, the Meiri at least is very uncomfortable. So you follow what I mean? The Meiri is going to try to mitigate a little bit the guilt of Rav Nosson, but he can't go too far because then why did Rav Yosef put him into Nidui? There's the Meiri. that the case is that it was Chag HaShavuos, it was Yom Tov Sheni, and Rab Nosson walked by foot into Pumbedisa, and he violated the Isur Tchumen by walking more than 2,000 amma outside the city limits of Pumbedisa. Says the Meiri, he did not violate a doraisa. Again, when I say doraisa, it's a little bit confusing here because we're talking about Yom Tov Sheni Shalgolias. But, let's say in the worst case scenario, we'll call it a malacha doraisa. He violated the Isur Tchumen, which is only D'Rabbanan. Again, you may recall that Rabbi Akiva held that Tchumen is doraisa, but even Rabbi Akiva is probably only on Shabbos and not on Yom Tov. But we don't pass like Rabbi Akiva in any event. So Chutz L'Tchum is only D'Rabbanan. My humble opinion, again, I could be wrong. A lot of things that I'm saying today, I'm telling you, it's just my own thoughts. That the Meiri is trying to answer an additional question. It's not just that the Meiri could not fathom how Reb Nosson could do malacha in Pumbedis on Yom Tov Sheni. That's bad enough. But he wanted to answer another question. Vosep is nidui. Why is nidui relevant? Why is that appropriate? And then the Gemara is going to attack Rav Yosef. They should have given him Malchus. And Rav Yosef is going to defend himself. No, they didn't want to give him that severe of a punishment of Malchus. They gave him the less severe punishment. And they put him into nidui. And the Gemara is going to have a whole discussion, which is a more chamer punishment. Nidui or makas martis. Could be that the Meiri places nidui here in this sugya into a particular context, namely that he violated a derabbanan, and that deserves nidui. Why? Because if you violated derabbanan, then to some extent you are undermining the authority of the rabbanan to generate isuri. Now, again, if it's a case of a gzeira derabbanan, then I wouldn't say that you're undermining the authority of the chachamim. A gzeira derabbanan is an isur, and although it's only an isur derabbanan, you decided that you would eat meat and milk on the same table, whatever it is, halal al shulchan. So you're not worried, or whatever it is, you violated this isur. That's one kind of situation. But tchumen is a whole different story. Tchumen is not what you call asus yag l'Torah, meaning a gzeira, because, if you walk more than 2,000 amas outside the city, who knows what's going to happen? You're going to violate the Shabbos. No, that's not what Tchumen is all about. Tchumen is all about the Rabbanon creating or designing your experience of Menucha Shabbos, of Oneg Shabbos, of Kavod Shabbos, and the same thing in Yom Tov. Here the Rabbanon are creating a new entity called Tchumen. So I'm just going to suggest, again, this is not written in any book, so it's not Holy of Holies. But what the Meiri is trying to accomplish here by introducing Halicha Chutz L'Tchum into the picture, first, he's, as we said before, he's solving the problem of how Reb Nosson could have done malach on Yom Tov Sheni. But secondly, I think he's trying to understand nidui in context. He, in a certain sense, what Reb Yosef was accusing Reb Nosson of doing was, I know exactly how to observe Yom Tov, and for me, walking from my local town to Pumbedisa outside the Tchum, that doesn't upset me. That deserves need. Why Rav Yosef have you chosen nidu? This man deserves makas mardus. Why? Now, again, without the Meiri, it could be that he did a malacha on Yom Tov Sheni, and that deserves makas mardus. If you go with the Meiri, we're going to assume that even a violation of Tchumin D'Rabbanan will generate Makas Mardus. Amalei Adifa Avdile. You know what? In my humble opinion, again, we'll soon see a different lishon in the Gemara that dissents. He deserves the more chomer of two punishments. And therefore, I'm going to put him into Nidu. Nidu is more chomer. And the Meiri again adds a comment here that Rav Yosef was operating on the best for the best interests of Rabbi Nosson. What does that mean, the best interest? You want to put him into Nidui? That's like humiliating. And Rav Yosef insists that that's a worse punishment than Makas Mardus. By the way, you know, Makas Mardus is not as severe as Makas Doraisa. And Makas Doraisa, you know, they hit him. Again, they have to be careful how hard they hit him and so forth and so on. But they hit him. You know, Makas Mardus is almost like, you know, symbolic. You know, it's Kal Shebekal. But Nidui is more humiliating. You know, you can't do work with him, and you can't come within Talad Amas of him. I mean, that's like, you know, a humiliating kind of experience. Maybe we'll get a chance to learn the laws of Nidui. The Rambam dedicates an entire chapter to the laws of Nidui. And by the way, where does he place it? You know, the Rambam is very sensitive to categorization. Where does he categorize the laws of Nidui? Anybody know? I'm testing you.
What?
I'm going to give you a Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, which has 14 books, and each one of the books average has 5 subsections. So, you know, you multiply 5 by 14, yeah, you're talking about a massive, you know, it's hard to guess this. All the laws of Nidui are codified by the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah has 7 chapters, the last of which is dedicated to the laws of Nidui. Why? He couldn't find a better place? All right, the Shulchan Aruch will put it into Yoreh De'ah. If there's anything that doesn't fit anywhere, you put it to Yoreh De'ah. But why does the Rambam choose Hilchos Talmud Torah? The answer is because essentially Nidui is for someone who undermines Kvod Chacham. The 6th parak of Hilchos Talmud Torah is dedicated to Kvod Talmidei Chacham. The 7th to Nidui. And there's a direct connection between the two. So now Rav Yosef says, I'm going to give him the worst of 2 punishments. Says the Meiri, he's operating on behalf for the best interest of Rav Nosson. That sounds counterintuitive. If he was the advocate for Rav Nosson, he should have given him the lesser punishment. Says the Meiri, an unbelievable chiddush. I mean, but it's so eminent that in order to achieve kapara, you need the proper onesh. And if you get a lesser onesh than what you deserve, you will not achieve kapara for your sin through that onesh. So Rav Yosef, working on the best interest of Rav Nosson, wants to give him the more profound, the more severe punishment to guarantee he achieves kapara. I don't know if according to Miri, Rav Yosef was vacillating back and forth and he decided l'chumra, or Rav Yosef felt that this violation was severe enough so that he would not achieve kapara by just giving him these symbolic 39 lashes. And the Gemara tells us now the following. Dibemarova mimnu angida dibar beirav v'lo mimnu ashamta. Ashamta is a need. So in Eretz Yisrael, the tradition was that if a Talmud, I don't know how to translate the Hebrew, sarach. Sarach means he undermines the authority of the Chachamim. Then what they do is they gather together, the Chachamim, and they give him Malchus. Why? Because they don't want to give him a more severe punishment of Nidui, and they were Choshesh for Kvod HaTorah. And to put him into Nidui, we see that Nidui is more Chum. So how does Rav Yosef defend himself against the argument of Abaye? Abaye says, let's give him Malchus. So Rav Yosef says, no, Adifa Avdile. We're going to give him the more severe punishment. Why? Because in Eretz Yisrael, they were knowing that when a Talmud sarach, hayu chacham nimnim u'mischabrim la'al koso, below hayu mischabrim linidoso. And the reason for that in Eretz Yisrael, they wanted to give him the lighter punishment. And nidui is the more severe punishment. So that's the minhag in Eretz Yisrael. But we are not in Eretz Yisrael. We're in Pumbedisa, we're in Bavel. And we want to give him the more chomer punishment, which is nidui. So in Eretz Yisrael, if a person scoffed and undermined the authority of the Chachamim, they gave him the lesser punishment, and it was enough to give him the Malchus. But we want to, dish out the letter of the law and give him the more harsh punishment. And we're in Pumbedisa, we're not in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore we're going to put him into Nid. That's the first Lishna, and that's the way they recorded the story of Rav Yosef with Rav Nos. Ika di Amri, another version has it just the opposite. Nagde Rav Yosef had Rav Nosson receive Makas Mardus. Omalei Abayi Nishamte Mar, why don't you give him a punishment of Nidui? And now, all of a sudden, according to the second Lishna, both Rav Yosef and Abayi switch positions. Just like Rav Yosef switched his position. He originally, in the first, I shouldn't say switched, meaning historically, I don't mean sequentially, but in the first Lishna, Rav Yosef was of the opinion that the more chomer punishment is nidui. According to the second opinion, Rav Yosef chose Malchus because that's the more severe punishment. Abaye now switches his position. Originally, he thought Abaye in the first Lishna that Malchus is more severe. And therefore he said to him, Nagde mar Nagde. And now on the contrary, Abaye's position is that Shamta Nidui is the more severe punishment. And to prove this, he says the Rav Ushmuel Diami Shavayu Menadim al Shnei Yomim Tovim Shel Goliath. That the more severe punishment for someone who undermines Yom Tov Sheni is not Malchus, but rather Shamta, rather Nidui, Menadim. Amalei, so Rav Yosef says to Abaye, and this reflects a little bit of what we discussed before about the minhag in Eretz Yisrael, Hani mili inish di alma. If a person undermines and desecrates Yom Tov Shein Shel Goliath, he's a rank and file citizen, then we have to hit him with the brunt of the law, and we're going to put him into Nidu and give him that punishment of Nidu. However, Hacha, in the case of Rav Nosson, Tzur Mimirabananu, he's a Talmud Chacham, and if we put him into Nidu, that's really an insult to a Talmud Chacham. Nidu is humiliating. Is the Tavalei Avde. We're going to give him the lesser of two punishments. And that's what the minig was in Eretz Yisrael, to be Marava Mimnu Anigdasa, to Bar Beirav Velo Mimnu Ashamta. That in Eretz Yisrael, when a Talmud went off and he scoffed at the Chachamim, then they gathered together and they gave him Malchus, and they didn't go as far as being Menadeh because they didn't want to put a Nidui on a Talmud Chacham, on these Talmidei Chachamim. That would be an undermining of Kavod Torah. And the same thing, says Rav Yosef, I'm going to do here in the case of Rav Nosson, he's a Talmud Chacham, and therefore I should, just 1 second, again, in Eretz Yisrael, they went light on a Talmud Chacham, and therefore they gave him Malchus, and they didn't want to put him to Nidiv because they were Choshesh for Kavod Torah. So we're going to derive from the minig in Eretz Yisrael that they gave him the Onesh Kal, and that was Malchus, correct? That was Malchus. Oh, so we got it right. So Rav Yosef said, I am going to reflect the minhag in Eretz Yisrael, and because Rav Nosson is a Talmud Chacham, I'm going to let him off the hook with a lesser punishment. I'm going to just give him Malchus, and I will spare him of Nidui because that would undermine Kavod HaTov. Okay, now both sides.
All right. If you want to know what Rav Steinsaltz did,
Yeah,
he did a very cute thing. He basically, at the beginning of the sugya, he says that the girsa that Rashi and Tosfos has is ana. It's singular because it was still a time when you had the Mishlichei Beis Din, but the girsa he has in the Gemara is ananya dina. We already have the calendar and it's fixed. So he plays games with the girsa to change what people.
but does he? I wanted to ask you this, Dr. Wolf. Does Rabbi Stein, does he give you any insight into the history? Like, when exactly did Rav Safra live? This should be something we could check out scientifically, no?
Well, yeah, I think because he puts Ananya Dinon for the Gemara, and his gears of the Gemara is that Rav Safra was there after, and everybody knew because the calendar had already been done by Hillel.
Right. No, I agree with what you're saying. But I'm just wondering if we have any method of checking this out historically. When exactly did Rav Safra live?
No. I'm sure that I have a book of the Doros, so I'm sure it's in there someplace.
See if you could, again, I don't know if you have time for this, but if you could research that and figure out what was his time framework in relation to Hillel's calendar,
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
And in Mitzvah Shem, tomorrow we'll pick it up with Kayotze Bo Hamolich Peros Shvius. And we get back to the Sugya Mitzvah Shem of Shvius, but not Kruv, in this case, just Perot Shvius. And we're talking about the principle of Kol L'Chayim in Asada, and that species in one particular area is Kol L'Chayim in Asada, so we have to L'Chayim Bira in another location, it's Lo Kol L'Chayim in Asada. So that's the two dots here on about 15 lines down from the top. And that's a Mitzvah Shem, where we'll pick it up tomorrow.